Before I start, or as I start, I want to dispel some of the myths relating to the Cregagh colony. Firstly, the houses were not built specifically for men who had served with the Ulster Division. Secondly, I've seen in various places where it said, if you look at the colony from the Castlereagh Hills, or if you look at the colony on Google Maps, it's in the shape of a Union Jack. It is not. I will be referring to the ISSLT frequently during this talk. That stands for Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust. And they were the organisation that was responsible for administering and overseeing the construction of houses from 1924 and the administration of houses that were built before 1924. Right, let's see if this works. There we go. So there's an overview. That's from the ISSLT annual report for 1924-26. And as you can see, it does not look like a Union flag. If anything, it looks more like a South African flag. Having said that, if you look at this cluster here, that does look like a Union flag. And the same with this cluster, very, very loosely. But it's not enough to say that it's correct. October 1923, a proposal to construct 146 houses was accepted by Castlereagh Rural District Council, and all the houses had been completed by the end of 1925, which is why we're here today, because this is as close to the Centenary as I could get. This was the largest of the ISSLT developments in Northern Ireland. So there were 1,252 houses built for ex-servicemen across Northern Ireland between 1921 and 1939. And this was the largest ones with 146 houses. The largest in the island of Ireland was at Killester in Dublin, where there were over 200 houses. So the building of the ex-servicemen houses was an all-Ireland affair because it started in 1919 with the Irish Land, open brackets, Provision for Sailors and Soldiers Act, which set aside monies for the construction of houses specifically for veterans of the Great War. I think there was about 4,000 built across the island of Ireland, with the majority being built in what became the Irish Free State. So that's the layout from the plans, and this layout marks each house as well, according to its style. There were three styles of houses built in the Cregagh colony. This is an early map showing the layout, which, as you can see, is identical to the plan. The houses were built on a 17-acre parcel of land that was purchased from the the Marquess of Downshire for £2,084, 7 shillings and 8 pence. And that equates to approximately £120,000, 686 pounds, or £7,000 an acre. Now, if a builder was trying to buy land within what's now the Belfast City Council area, which would include Cregagh, you'd be paying a heck of a lot more than that for an acre of land. And that's because the people who are selling the land, and this is repeated across the province, where the land purchased for the building of ex-servicemen's houses is relatively low compared to modern. And I think that part of that is the people who are selling the land were doing so as a means of commemorations, as a means of memory. So they were providing the land at a discounted price to show their gratitude for what the people who had lived in the houses had gone through. On average, each house was built on a 0.12 acre parcel of land, so they had considerable gardens. Doesn't really show up in this map, but when you look at these houses compared to the houses on the front of the Cregagh Road, you can see how large the gardens were. That was because they were designed so that the occupants could, although they weren't officially supposed to have any livestock, but I think a blind eye was turned to that, because I know from other situations that occupants kept pigs and goats and chickens and whatnot on their piece of land. Also, they were encouraged to try to become not self-sufficient, but to work their own gardens to produce food. In other words, like a market garden. And that just wasn't because they wanted people to be more self-sufficient, but it was also a very important aspect in dealing with the likes of trauma. So being out in the fresh air, working your garden, was a therapeutic activity as well. There are 3 styles of house in the colony. There are 28 type W1 houses, 38 type W2, and they were all semi-detached. And there are 80 type W3, which were built in 4 house blocks. The initial rent was 10 shillings per week, and that equates to about £30 per week. Now, I'll come on to talk about the houses, but basically you're getting a 3-bedroom house. Now, can you imagine trying to rent a 3-bedroom semi-detached house for, what did I say, 30 quid a week? Do you think you could do that in Belfast? No. So again, the rents that were being charged were not consistent with the rents in the rest of the housing market. They were discounted because the purpose of the rent was to provide income so that maintenance could be maintained on the properties. So if there was a storm, maybe called Amy, I don't know, in 1930, and some houses lost the slates off their roofs, the ISSLT would have gone in and made good the repairs. Every 5 years or so, the ISSLT would have issued tenders for people who wanted to tender for the painting of houses. All the houses in the Cregagh colony, and indeed across the ISSLT stock across Northern Ireland, with the exception of one in North Belfast, whose name I've just forgotten. They were all white, they were all concrete finished, and then they were whitewashed. So every few years they would have a tender for people to come in and re-whitewash it. The money to pay those contractors came from the rents. So the rents were designed not to make a profit, but to generate money for maintenance, and also to generate money for the building of additional houses in other locations. Of the 146 original occupants, only 84 were still residing in the colony in 1932. Over 40% of the occupants had moved on. Several potential explanations. Possibly they decided to emigrate to one of the Dominions. They might have had to move to another part of Belfast for employment. But one aspect was that the ISSLT were quite harsh in pursuing people for the non-payment of rent, which sits at odds with the whole ethos of the process of having ex-servicemen's cottages. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. With the concentration of ex-servicemen, it's hardly surprising that they formed their own branch of the British Legion. So the Cregagh branch of the British Legion constructed a hall, which now is round about here. So it was close to the colony, but it was not inside the colony. And you get the same, for example, at White Abbey, where the British Legion Hall is adjacent to the Cambrai Park ex-servicemen's houses, but outside it. Similarly, at Massines Park in Londonderry, the British Legion Hall is just outside, because the British Legion did not have any involvement in the process of building the houses or administering the houses. What they did do was to provide support to men applying for a house, but also for men who ran into difficulties, and I'll give an example of that shortly. There was also an on-site general merchandise store at the end of Hamel Drive. So that was called Hamel Stores, and it was round about there. The houses were surrounded by open countryside, which is why I refer to it as being a colony, because it was sort of on the outskirts of Belfast. Only a string of houses on the front of the Cregagh Road, and it was close to the junction of the terminus for the Belfast trams. So in other words, it provided the men that lived there with close transport to get into town, to get to the likes of the shipyards or Mackey's or Sirocco Works or wherever they worked. The well-known photographer, Belfast photographer Alexander Robert Hogg, was engaged to produce a photographic record of the development, and these images are from a file that's held at PRONI. If anyone wants the file reference, it's there. Fin/14/3/1/1. I see you're all writing that down avidly. If anyone wants to get a copy of that, see me at the end and I'll let you know what it is. How many people here are familiar with the Cregagh colony? Right, so an awful lot more than lived there. So this photograph shows, this is the end house at Picardy Avenue, the end house at Ballyhackamore Avenue, and this area here in front is roughly where the War Memorial would be now. And it's a fantastic photograph because you're actually seeing different styles. You can see the 4 block there, and you can see this block of houses and this block, or this pair of houses. Also notice the windows. Very small panes, separated, I think, by aluminium. And you'll see it if you go to the Cregagh colony today, or what used to be the Cregagh colony, you'll see that a lot of houses have been modernised. They've put in new PVC windows, but some of them have put in new PVC windows which mimic the original style of the house, so that when you look at it from the front, it looks more or less like it did 100 years ago. In this photograph you can also see a wee railway track there, which was used to bring materials onto the site. So that was hooked up to the Belfast tram line. So materials, building materials, wood, bricks, so forth, sand, cement, whatever, could be brought up from the docks or from the warehouses or whatever, straight into the colony, so the guys didn't have to lump it from Cregagh Road or from Bell's Lane. This photograph is taken from the Bell's Lane end. Bell's Lane is now Montgomery Road, which it was renamed in the 1950s after the Field Marshal. And of course, any photograph that you ever see from this period, there has to be the mandatory urchins in it. Okay, there has to be. It was the law. Okay, you had to have a wee urchin or two. I don't know whether these urchins or children belonged to the families that lived there, or whether they just happened to be around. When you're looking at that, you can see the curve up to Picardy Avenue, or up Picardy Avenue towards Steepville Avenue. This is my favourite of these photographs. This photograph was taken at the junction of Somme Drive and Somme Drive and Thiepval Avenue. And this is a steam contraption which was being used to grind down rock and stones into gravel, which would then be used on the roadway to provide the surface level of the roadway. Each of the houses in the colony had the same facilities, although the sizes of the rooms varied between house type, as did the internal layout of the room. But in general, each house contained, on the ground floor, there was a scullery kitchen, there was a larder, a coal store, a bathroom, 1925, interior bathroom, interior toilet. The guys that had lived in the Lower Newtonards Road or the Shankle Road before the war, moving into a house where you don't have to go out into the yard in the middle of the night to use the toilet, or even during the middle of the day, it was light years ahead. There was a water closet, toilet, and the living room. The first floor contained 3 bedrooms, and there were fireplaces in the ground floor lounge and in 2 of the bedrooms, so you get in a house with 3 fireplaces as well. The Type W1 cottage, which is this one here, the only difference between the Type W1 and the Type W2 in essence is the layout of the windows and the positioning of chimneys at the end of the house. But apart from that, they are very broadly similar. Type W1 cottage had a square footage of 756 square feet, and the W2 was 757 square feet. So even by the standard of the day, they were generally larger houses in terms of the floor print than the men would have lived in before the war. The Type W3 was a bit different. As I said, it was a 4-house terrace. The end house had a total floor area of 779, and the centre houses had a floor area of 756. So not only did the end houses have access down the sides of the house to their back gardens and to where they would have stored their bins, but they were also larger. So if you got one of the interior ones, you might feel a wee bit hard done by. But again, it depends on the size of the family. So that's 1925. That's what the houses looked like. And these plans, these drawings are from the ISSLT's own documentation. 1928, March 1928, the ISSLT started to, well, in 1928 they sought eviction of tenants. This is just one headline that I came across. And these were men who had fallen into arrears with their rents. Cases were brought to the magistrates' court. One of the cases involved a resident of Picardy Avenue who had been employed as a messenger at the Ministry of Pensions. Now, a lot of the ex-servicemen were given preferential treatment for government positions. So you find a lot of men who had served in the Great War ending up as messengers in the civil service or indeed as postmen. The number of veterans that became postmen in the 1920s is just off the wall. He had been dismissed after a period of illness with a respiratory illness, quite possibly connected to being gassed during his war service. When the ISSLT sought eviction, he had been admitted to a sanatorium, so he probably had pulmonary tuberculosis or something similar to that, or pneumonia. The house was being lived in by his wife and 7 children. And the ISSLT were trying to evict the family because they hadn't paid the rent. Now, a woman in the 1920s with 7 children is not going to be out earning money. So basically, they were relying on his pension to be able to pay the rent. The representative of the ISSLT gave evidence that the rent had been reduced from 10 shillings per week to 8 shillings per week, so they had made an effort. Mr. George McElroy, chairman of the magistrates panel, went on record to express his opinion that the rents were too high, even at 8 shillings per week. The North Down Herald, in reporting on the cases, recorded Mr. McElroy as saying, "I suppose it was in the war that he contracted his sickness, and this was to be a country fit for heroes," which is what David Lloyd George had said in November 1918. The fighting is over, now the battle is to build a country that's fit for heroes to live in. Not very grammatically correct, but there you go. And then he said, but we won't go into that. A comment which elicited laughter in the courtroom. Whilst it is apparent that the magistrates had sympathy for the tenants, they also had to bear in mind the legal side. Now, from the ISSLT point of view, the rents were being paid in order to provide maintenance, as I've already said. So if one tenant is not paying their rent, it means they're not getting the income that's needed to carry on its work, the ISSLT's work. The magistrates did ask for the ISSLT to show leniency, but the magistrate had no option but to grant orders for eviction. So you had the situation where servicemen were being evicted from a house that was built to provide them with accommodation, which seems at total odds to the ISSLT's sort of underlying ethos. I'm going to look at one particular case. Does this name ring a bell to anyone? Nope? Okay. Angus McGugan lived at 20 Hamill Drive. Sorry, he lived at 16 Hamill Drive in 1926 and 1927, and then he was at 20 Hamill Drive in 1928. He was born on 18th October 1883 at Newtonards Road to John McGugan, a blacksmith, and Mary Perry. In 1911, the family was living at Parkgate Avenue, and their denomination was recorded as United Free Church of Scotland. Angus was recorded as being an engine fitter when he married Elizabeth Wotherspoon on 18th October 1912 at Ballyhackamore Methodist Church, and they were living at Caledonia Terrace on Park Avenue when Angus enlisted with the Royal Naval Reserve as an engine room artificer on 26th July 1915. He was serving on HMS Ambrose when he was demobilised on 28th June 1919 and was an inaugural member and secretary of the Engineers and Engine Room Artificers branch of the British Legion. Bit of a mouthful, that. In February 1928, the court granted the ISSLT permission to evict Angus McGugan for non-payment of rent. However, the British Legion provided employment which enabled him to avoid eviction. In 1929, he was the secretary of the Belfast branch British Legion and was in charge of the annual Poppy Day appeal. He remained in his ISSLT cottage until his death on 3rd April 1966 at the age of 82. Elizabeth McGugan died at 20 Hamill Drive on 12 February 1980, aged 94. Angus and Elizabeth are buried in Dundonald Cemetery, so you can see his name there. Mr. Angus McGugan, Secretary, 13 Montgomery Street, which is in Belfast City Centre. So that was the headquarters of the British Legion at that time. 1-4 house, Type W3 terrace was built on Bells Lane between Picardy Avenue and Bapalm Avenue. The roadway originally ran to the Bell Farm Dairy, hence Bells Lane and Bells Bridge. In the late 1940s, Bells Lane was renamed as Montgomery Road after Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, Viscount of Alamein. The original occupant at Cottage 1 was Edward McNary, who was born around 1880 in Barrow-in-Furness in Lancashire, to James McNary, a joiner, and Catherine Duncan. The family had moved back to Ireland by 1891 and was living at Bright Street in the Pottinger district in 1901. Edward was a tailor when he enlisted with the Royal Field Artillery on 19th March 1900 and was a bombardier stationed at Kildare when he married Kathleen McAvoy from Dublin on 4th January 1905 at St George's Church of Ireland in Dublin. He was deployed to France on 30th May 1915 and served with 62nd Brigade. He was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. So that's, for those of you not familiar, that's that medal there, which in the gallantry hierarchy is one step down from a Victoria Cross for for people who were not commissioned officers. So in other words, anyone from private up to regimental sergeant major. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. He has rendered good and meritorious service and has, quote, set a splendid example in carrying out whatever task he has been allotted to him under varied conditions of danger and difficulty." The War Office Daily List of 16th January 1918 reported that he had been wounded. And another War Office list on 13th May 1918 reported that he had been wounded for a second time. Edward was a sergeant tailor when he was awarded the Long Service Good Conduct Medal, which is this one at the end, in 1921, and was discharged from the army on 18th March 1922, having served for 22 years. After the war, Edward was employed as a messenger in the civil service. Kathleen McNary, his wife, died on 23rd December 1944 at the age of 64, and Edward was listed as the occupant of the house, which now had a Montgomery Road address, in the 1960 street directory, but he was not listed in the 1965 directory. Edward McNally was living with a married daughter when he contracted bronchopneumonia and died at Belfast City Hospital on 3rd January 1968, aged 87. Bapaume Avenue. 25 houses were built on Bapaume Avenue, which is one of the arms that links into Thiepval Avenue. So that's one of the block of 4 houses at Bapaume Avenue. And the occupant at number 2 was Alexander Cregagh, and he was born on 11th December 1887 at Richardson Street to Alexander Cregagh, who was a clerk, and Elizabeth Wilson, and the family was living at Ardnley Avenue in 1911. He was an electrician when he married Kathleen Gibson on 14th July 1910 at what was then called Dundela Presbyterian Church, which is now Knock Presbyterian Church. They were living at Fountain Street in Londonderry when his son William was born in December 1910, and back in Ardgowan Street in Belfast in April 1911. Alexander Cregagh enlisted for war service on 1st September 1914 and was a sergeant in the Army Cycling Corps when he landed at Gallipoli with 10th Irish Division. He was admitted to the 2nd Western General Hospital in Chester with an unspecified illness on 16th February 1916. While serving in Salonika, he was admitted to number 5 Canadian General Hospital with malaria. So he had already contracted some sort of illness when he was in Gallipoli. Then he was in Salonika and he contracts malaria. He was on depot duties when he was treated for dysentery in October 1916, so he wasn't having a great war in terms of what was going on with his body. Transferred to the Royal Flying Corps as an air mechanic on 17th July 1917 and transferred to the Royal Air Force when it was established in April 1918. He was the leading aircraftsman with 142 Squadron when he was transferred to the Royal Air Force Class G Reserve on 28th June 1919. So the idea that November 1918, you have the armistice, that's the war over, everyone comes home, just did not happen. There were still guys on active service in France well into 1919 because the war did not end until the signing of the Treaty of Versailles towards the end of May 1919. And that's why in some church memorials you will see the years registered as 1914, 1919 rather than 1418. Just a wee aside. Alexander was recorded as the occupant of 2 Bapaume Avenue in the 1928 Belfast Street Directory, replacing David Barr, who had been the previous tenant. A son of Alexander and Kathleen Cregagh had emigrated to Australia, and he had enlisted with the Australian Infantry for service in the Second World War. This son, William Cregagh, served in North Africa but was serving with the Adelaide Rifles when he was killed in action on 28th December 1942, aged 32, and is buried in the Port Moresby War Cemetery in Papua New Guinea. Alexander had enlisted with the Royal Ulster Rifles for home service duties in the Second World War and held the rank of sergeant when he died at his home of a coronary thrombosis and myocarditis on 1st June 1945, aged 57. Because he was in the army when he died, he qualifies for the Commonwealth War Graves headstone. He had been a member, not unexpectedly, of the Cregagh branch British Legion, but he was also a member of Cregagh Defenders LOL 1588, many of whose members lived in the Cregagh colony. In fact, it was formed, somebody's raising their eyebrows, was one of your relatives involved in that? Were they involved in starting it up? So this Cregagh Defenders Lodge was formed by men in the Cregagh colony, and they had an annual event which was round about the time of the commemoration of the Battle of Messines, June 1917. They held an annual service from the Cregagh colony down to Cregagh Methodist Church for an annual church parade. Not on the anniversary of the 1st of July, but on the anniversary of the Battle of Messines, which is a wee bit unusual. Kathleen Cregagh was still living at 2 Bapaume Avenue when she died at hospital on 22nd March 1968, aged 80. Kathleen was also a member of Cregagh Branch British Legion Women's Section Alexander and Kathleen Cregagh are buried in Knockbreeder Cemetery, and as I said, there's a Commonwealth War Graves headstone at their grave. Picardy Avenue is the other of the arms. There were 29 cottages built at Picardy Avenue. You might wonder how, if it's semi-detached and 4 houses, you can end up with an odd figure. That's because the two semi-detached houses at the head of Picardy and Bapaume are semi-detached, but one of them has a Bapaume Avenue address and one of them has a Picardy Avenue address. So we're going to look at Thomas Cassidy, who was the first occupant at number 1. He was born on 28th June 1894 at Keegan Street to Andrew Charles Cassidy, who was a painter, and Lizzie Josephine McCulloch. Thomas was also a painter when he enlisted with the Royal Navy on 11th September 1912 for a 12-year period of engagement, and that was the standard when you joined either the Army or the Navy before the First World War. You enlisted for 12 years, and generally it was 5 years spent with the regulars and then 7 years spent on the reserve. But a lot of men found that after the 5 years, they didn't want to go back to civilian life, so they extended their service so that the 7 years on the reserves became regular Army or regular Navy duty. Married Jane Ferguson McFerrin on 7th June 1918 at Rugby Avenue Congregational Church. He was invalided from the Royal Navy on 23rd April 1919 due to fibroid phthisis, which is spelt Phthis. How you get phthisis from that, I do not know, but there you go. It's sort of like a tuberculosis type. Pulmonary phthisis and pulmonary tuberculosis are the same. So I'm assuming that fibroid phthisis is something similar. It's just a more medical, archaic term. Cassidy family was living at 24 Holcombe Street when Thomas was allocated the ISSLT cottage at Picardy Avenue. John McFerrin Cassidy was born on 10th October 1919 at My Lady's Road. So that's Stuart McCracken territory. And he joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve in 1936. John was part of the Ulster Division based at HMS Caroline. And when you see Ulster Division, you tend to think of the British Army, 36th Ulster Division, and the heroics at the Somme, Messines, Langemarck, Saint Michel, and all those other places. But as a nod towards the military service in the First World War, the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve in Belfast had the name Ulster Division, because you don't generally have divisions in the Navy. You have ships and you have flotillas, and then you have whatever up to fleets. He was mobilised at the start of the Second World War on active service and was taken prisoner during the Battle of Hong Kong in December 1941. The family was officially notified that John was a prisoner of war in August 1942. So nearly a year later, John McFerrin Cassidy died of heart failure as a POW at the prisoner of war camp at Osaka in Japan on 29th June 1943, aged 23, and he's buried in the Yokohama War Cemetery in Japan. Thomas Cassidy died at Picardy Avenue on 28th February 1959, aged 64, and Jane Ferguson Cassidy died at Downshire Park Central on 7th March 1971, aged 74. Thomas and Jane are buried in Dundonald Cemetery, and so that's their headstone. And then there's a plaque, recumbent plaque at the bottom that commemorates the death of their son. You'll see as we go through that a lot of the men that lived in these cottages tended to die at a relatively early age, certainly by today's standards. Deepville Avenue. What I like about a lot of the houses in the Cregagh colony is that externally and from the front, they are generally the same as they were 100 years ago. That frontage hasn't changed in 100 years. Of course, there might be an extension at the back. The rooms might have been knocked through or whatever, but externally, they look as they did 100 years ago. And these type W houses, they had this strange roof line with a dropped eave, I think it's called. And that was, it was trying to make it look like an English country cottage. But an English country cottage generally has just one floor. So I think they're lovely to look at. And I love these massive big chimneys to make sure you've got a good draw. This house has obviously removed their end chimney. 32 cottages were built at Thiepval Avenue, and this pair of type W1 cottages are at the junction between Thiepval Avenue and Hamel Drive. Thomas Foreman was born on 17 September 1887 at Knockbracken to Samuel Foreman, a farmer, and Mary Martin. Thomas emigrated to Canada, leaving Belfast on board SS Lake Champlain on 9th May 1907. He had returned to Belfast and was living at Farnham Street when he married Mary Irvine from University Street on 21st August 1916 at the Belfast Registry Office. A few weeks later, he enlisted with the North Irish Horse on 16th October 1916. On 20th September 1917, he was transferred to the Royal Irish Fusiliers, joining the 9th North Irish Horse Battalion. North Irish Horse was obviously a cavalry regiment. By the time you get to 1917, there wasn't an awful lot of need for cavalry. You needed men on horseback to deliver messages from the front back to the generals or between units. So generally, a lot of the cavalry regiments were broken down, and some were retained as horsemen, but others were transferred into the infantry. So a lot of men from the North Irish Horse went into the 9th Battalion Royal Irish Fusiliers. Private Foreman was captured at La Varguer on 27th March 1918 during the German Spring Offensive, also known as the Battle of St. Quentin or the Battle of St. Michel. So it had a number of different names depending on, St. Michael even, depending on which source you're looking at. He had sustained gunshot wounds to his arm before being captured. He was held at a prisoner of war camp in Limburg, Darmstadt and Hamburg until he was repatriated to Belfast on 6th December 1918. He was discharged due to war-related sickness, probably incurred whilst being a prisoner of war. On 5th July 1919, and he was awarded a Silver War Badge. Does anyone here know what a Silver War Badge was? Nope. One guy's nodding, but he's doing it very surreptitiously. Silver War Badge was a badge that was issued to men who had been either wounded or sick, and they were no longer physically fit for military service. So they were honourably discharged and they were given this badge. The badge was introduced so they could wear it on their right lapel, and it meant that if they were out in the streets of Belfast or wherever, you wouldn't have these crazy women coming up to them and giving them a white feather. So that's the background for it. He was living at Knockbracken when he was awarded a 20% disablement pension in respect of a heart condition. The pension rate was 18 shillings per week, plus an allowance of 4 shillings and 8 for a wife and 2 children. The weekly pension of 22 shillings and 8 in 1920 would equate to approximately £55. So this was the pension that he was receiving on a weekly basis, from which he was expected to provide his rent and all the living costs. So that's a relatively generous pension. I've seen other men who were coming out with pensions a lot lower than that. Thomas worked on the trams after the war and died on 15th August 1945, aged 58. And Mary died on 21st January 1971, aged 77. Thomas and Mary Foreman are buried in the graveyard at Knockbracken Reformed Presbyterian Church. The house passed to their son and daughter-in-law, Tom and Lily Foreman, and remained in the Foreman family until Lily's death, in 2004. So that's, whatever it was, 80 odd years that had been in the one family. Now, on the succession, if the veteran died, his widow had the right to continue to live in the property and pay rent. until her death. If the widow of a veteran then died, the family's entitlement to the house ceased, because it was deemed that the veteran and his wife formed a veteran pair, and the house would have been needed for other veterans. There were still people, veterans of the Great War, on a waiting list for these houses and the houses in Northern Ireland in the mid-1960s. From 1952 onwards, the sitting tenant or the widow of the veteran could purchase the house. And in that scenario, when the widow died, it would transfer on to the family, which is what happened with the Foremans. By the time Mary Foreman died in 1971, they owned the house. Whether on a mortgage or outright, I don't know, but it was no longer a rented property. So it was the family's ownership, and they could pass it on to whomever they wanted. Albert Drive, you can see there's a lovely photograph there. Albert Drive, there's the photograph. 18 houses were built in Albert Drive. I said Albert Drive there. It should be Albert Drive because it's named after the Battle of Albert in France. With the exception of the pothole window or the porthole window here, that external view is almost exactly as it was when the houses were built. And again, you can see one of the chimney stacks has gone from one side of the house. Robert Foulis was the occupant at number 1 Albert Drive, and he was born on 23rd March 1888 at Perry Street to John Foulis and Georgina Service. He was a labourer and living at Henry Street when he married Jane Little from Nelson Street on 21st December 1910 at St Anne's Parish Church, as it was then. Now it's the Belfast Cathedral, obviously. Robert Foulis was living at Baskin Street and was an engine driver for the Belfast and County Down Railway when he enlisted with the Royal Engineers on 16th November 1914. He was in training with the 121st Field Company when he was promoted to Sergeant in June 1915. So within 7 months of enlisting, he was a Sergeant. Deployed to France with the Ulster Division in October 1915. He was admitted to number 12 Casualty Clearing Station on 12th January 1917, suffering from shell shock, and was transferred to number 4 Stationary Hospital before being discharged back to duties on 8th February. So basically, he had nearly a month away from the front line. He was transferred to the Railway's Operations Division in July 1917 and held the rank of Company Quartermaster Sergeant when he was transferred to the Class Z Army Reserve on 25th April 1919. Class Z Army Reserve was a category that was introduced in the early part of 1919 as a means of being able to take men from the Western Front and send them home to ease the burden of maintenance on the Western Front, because by that stage the authorities were certain the Germans were serious about the peace negotiations. When you had the armistice in November 1918, it was an armistice for 30 days. It was then extended for another 30 days into the middle of or tail end of December, and then for another 30 days into the tail end of January. In February, it was extended indefinitely because by that stage they knew that the Germans were serious and there was very little chance of the negotiations breaking down. But men were put into the Class Z Army Reserve so that in the eventuality of the peace talks breaking down and hostilities commencing, they would be immediately liable for recall to active service. Robert's occupation in the street directories is recorded as driver, which is a bit vague because it could mean a chauffeur, it could mean a tram driver, or it could mean a railway engine driver. So again, a bit vague. And he was the occupant in the 1935 directory, but not in 1936. By 1936, the family had moved to William Street in Donaghadee, where Robert died on 23rd June 1946, aged 58, and he's buried in Donaghadee Parish Church. A brother, John Foulis, who is also in this photograph, was recorded as the occupant of one of the ex-servicemen's cottages in Brandon Parade in Victoria area in the 1938 directory. Hamel Drive one of the semi-detached pairs. You can see there's an extension has been put onto the side of it, which to me totally ruins the look of it, but there you go. 18 houses were built on Hamill Drive, and this is a pair of type W1 cottages. 2 of the houses on Hamill Drive were demolished to facilitate the construction of sheltered accommodation at what's called Hamel Court. The 16 flats were built at a cost of £216,000 by the Miliband Trust, and the block was officially opened by Mr. Don Concannon, Minister of State for Health and Social Services. Who remembers Don Concannon? Yeah, a couple of people. The site also houses the offices of the Miliband Trust, which administered the ex-servicemen's houses in Northern Ireland from the late 1960s. So basically the ISSLT transferred the administration obligation onto the Miliband Trust, which is a charity. The objective of that charity is to provide accommodation for elderly people with limited means, particularly those from a service background. So it continues to provide the same sort of service as the ISSLT provided. And there are also, Miliband Trust has sheltered accommodation in Cambrai Park and also up at St. Quintin Park in Glengormley and possibly elsewhere. William Holland was recorded as the occupant at number 13 in the directories from 1926 to 28, with William Greenlee being listed as the occupant in 1929. With the Belfast Street directories, you've got to remember that they are always at least a year out. So the Belfast Street directory from 1929 would record the people who are listed as living in properties when the information was collated in 1928. William Greenlee was born on 28th April 1895 at 4th Street in the Shankill area to John Greenlee and Anne Jane Whiteside. In 1911, the family was living at Templemore Street, and William was a labourer at the Belfast Rope Works. He was a member of the East Belfast Regiment UVF when he enlisted with the Royal Irish Rifles on 5th September 1914 and was posted to France with 8th Battalion in October 1915. He suffered shell shock on 2nd July 1916 during the opening days of the Battle of Albert, the first phase of the 1916 Battles of the Somme. Sustained severe gunshot wounds on 3rd August 1917 and was posted to home service duties from 25th August 1917. Following the amputation of his right arm, he was discharged on 12th March 1918 with the Silver War Badge. William was awarded an 80% disability pension at the rate of 32 shillings a week. In July 1920, he received a grant of £50 from the Military Services Civil Liabilities Departments to start up a coal delivery business. William married Sophia Haldane on 28th October 1920 at Knockbreda Parish Church. Robert Greenlee was born on 2nd February 1922 and died on 10th December 22, so less than a year old, being buried in Knock Burial Ground. Another son, James Greenlee, died at 13 Hamill Drive on 2nd December 1931, aged 13 days, and is buried in the public ground at Belfast City Cemetery. Sophia's brother, Gunner Robert Haldane, died as a result of an accident in North Africa on 8th December 1943, aged 27, while serving with a light anti-aircraft regiment of the Royal Artillery. So you could say they didn't have far to go for their troubles. William Greenlee was a gateman when he died on 25th September 1947, aged 51, and is buried in Dundonald Cemetery. So again, you're seeing that a lot of these guys are dying in their 50s, whereas today the same person would be living to 60, 70, possibly even 80. Somme Drive. This house is at the far end of Somme Drive in its own little cul-de-sac. 20 houses were built in Somme Drive, and one half of this Type W1 cottage. So you can actually see the original, no, that's a shadow. This part here is an extension that's been added onto the house. But you can see they've made an attempt Not a very good attempt, it must be said, but they've made an attempt to try and replicate the roof line. But to me, I think these houses should be protected. For some of them now it's too late, but it's just that they're so unique within the context of Northern Ireland. The tall chimneys at both properties have been removed. In the 1926 Belfast Street Directory, there was only one occupant listed for Somme Drive, and that was William Major Harvey. He was born on 21st December 1887 at Greencastle in County Donegal, to William Harvey, a joiner, and Elizabeth Calvin. Family was living at Donegal in 1901, but had moved to Bloomfield Avenue in Belfast by 1911. William was a tram conductor when he married Margaret Orr on 5th April 1911 at Dundela Presbyterian Church, which, as I said, is now called Knock Presbyterian. William enlisted with the Army Service Corps. Obviously, his work as a tram conductor meant that he probably had a bit of mechanical knowledge, and so it was most obvious to go into the Army Service Corps because they had a lot of mechanised transport and also horse-drawn transport. He enlisted on 8th December 1914 and was posted to France with 254 Company of the Ulster Divisional Train in October 1915. The Ulster Divisional Train was not choo-choos. The word train in that context means like a convoy. So people think, well, why would they be using trains in France? But it's just an archaic army term. He served on the Western Front until 31st December 1917 and was transferred to the Class Z Army Reserve on 17th February 1919. He was living at Nevis Avenue in East Belfast when he was awarded a 20% disability pension in respect of deafness at the rate of 8 shillings per week. William is commemorated on the memorial tablet for Magain Memorial Presbyterian Church on the Lower Newtonards Road. Margaret died on 21st March 1954, aged 62, and William was still living at Somme Drive when he died on 15th November 1969 at the age of 81. And they're both buried in Knockbreda Cemetery. This is the core picture here from the newspaper is fantastic. I just wish they hadn't put in the couple of inserts, but they had to do what they had to do. 10th November 1929, newspapers reported that 2,000 people had gathered at Cregagh Colony to witness the unveiling of the Celtic Cross War Memorial, commemorating those from Cregagh district who fell in the Great War. The unveiling was performed by the Right Honourable John Miller Andrews, whose younger brother Thomas had been the managing director of Harland and Wolff and had perished in the sinking of RMS Titanic. Amongst the numerous wreaths laid were ones by Willowfield Unionist Club and by various youth organisations, including the Boys Brigade. Now, if you go onto Google Maps and you go to the junction on Google Maps between Bapalm Avenue, Picardy Avenue and Thiepval Avenue, you will find the War Memorial is referred to as the Bapalm Avenue Memorial. That is a nonsense. I don't know where that's originated from, but it's no more on Bapalm Avenue than it's on Picardy Avenue, or indeed Thiepval Avenue. It's situated smack in the middle of those two semi-detached houses, one of which is a Picardy Avenue address and one is Bapalm Avenue address. That photograph is taken looking down Thiepval Avenue. To name it after any one of those streets is, to be perfectly frank, I think it's disrespectful of the people from the Cregagh district. It is the Cregagh and District War Memorial. That's its title. Sorry, a bit of a rant there, wasn't it? This is Robert Haldane and Robert Haldane, father and son. Master Robert Haldane of Templemore Street was one of the two lads. So up here you've got two lads from the Boys Brigade laying a wreath. Over here you've got two members of a band of some description laying a wreath. And this man here is a Great War veteran because you can see the medals he's wearing. Not enough to make out the medals, but looking at them, it's a standard trio that would have been awarded for the Great War. Robert Haldane Jr. is wearing his father's 3 medals, albeit he's not wearing them in the correct order. But then, who's going to argue? Me. Rifleman Robert Haldane of the 8th Battalion Royal Irish Rifles had been killed in action on 2nd July 1916, leaving his widow, Jessie, and 7 children. Robert being the youngest of those 7 children. And Robert Haldane Sr. is commemorated on the War Memorial in Cregagh Methodist Church. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings this talk to an end. Thank you very much for your attention.